Some people have said that Amelia Simmons' American Cookery Cookbook from 1796 is the second Declaration of Independence. Now that might be an exaggeration, and some people have completely poo-pooed the idea and said that this book is just a simple, small extension of English cookery of the 18th century. But I disagree. I do think this is somewhat like the Declaration of Independence in that the Declaration of Independence was describing the new ideas of governance and how government deals with people that was being developed in the Americas for almost 200 years before it. This cookbook is doing the same thing with cookery, with foodways. It's explaining that the American experience with foods has been changing or had been changing for 150, 180 years before this book was published. The people that came into the New World had to come up with completely new ideas. The foods were different. The kinds of things they had available to cook was different. And the people who needed them and what they needed them for was different also. So new foods had to come into being. Amelia Simmons doesn't invent any of the recipes in here. She's describing these great new dishes that people had been eating for probably over 150 years, but nobody'd written down the recipes. So who is Amelia Simmons? Well, I'm not sure that any of us really know exactly who she is. We've got some hints here. This was published in Connecticut, in Hartford. It was published in 1796, and she talks about being an orphan, but I'm not sure that that's necessarily true. There's also controversy about if she wrote the entire cookbook. And obviously some pieces are copied out of earlier cookbooks, which so many cookbooks do, but for the vast quantity of what's in here, it does seem new and particularly applicable to the American condition. This is definitely a different cookbook. It is very, very small, much smaller than any of the English cookery books that came before it, and it has special things going on with it. It's got the first mentions of cornmeal, of chemical leavening, of cranberries, and other items that show up that are specifically American in invention or in development. And it's got specific mentions of holidays, and it seems like specific holiday cooking. We've picked several standout recipes to show you what's going on with this cookbook and the very, very unique recipes that you'll find in it for the time period. Amelia Simmons' cookbook has holiday-style recipes in it. In fact, she mentions things like Christmas in her cookbook, which is kind of rare for English cookery books of the 18th century. So Amelia Simmons' cookbook is very different in that. And it also has recipes that we would classify as holiday. In fact, basically the whole Thanksgiving feast is within her little cookbook. And one of these classic features of an American Thanksgiving is a turkey, a roast turkey. She mentions roast turkey twice in her cookbook. We're going to do one of her roast turkey recipes kind of right down the wire. Just do it exactly like she would do it. Very different than how we might do a roast turkey today, but we're going to experiment with that. We've made these in the past and they really turn out great. Some people think the best part of the roast turkey is the stuffing that goes in the turkey, and she has a great stuffing recipe that goes in there. We are going to start off with a pound of bread. So we take a pound loaf of bread and we pull it apart. You want to use, this is the main part of stuffing, so use the very best, your best favorite bread recipe for your stuffing. But I went ahead and left the crust on it too, because if we have a nice softer kind of crust, it makes a good bite to the stuffing. This stuffing also has an ingredient which we probably wouldn't think of putting into our stuffing today, but that is beef suet. She uses 3 ounces of beef suet, and that can be a little hard to find, but it is available today. It's been getting a lot more popular in the last 5 or 6 years, and this beef suet has been shredded up so it's nice and small. She's got spices in here. We have, of course, salt and pepper. We've got marjoram, and we've got thyme. It's got some egg in it too. We're gonna put 2 eggs into this and then mix our stuffing up so that it is completely mixed, and then that gets stuffed into the cavity of the turkey. Yes, stuffing it into the turkey isn't maybe a modern thing. A lot of times we take the stuffing and we cook that separately, but in the 18th century, it definitely goes into the turkey. Now that our stuffing is in, we need to sew up the bird. We're just going to sew across it to hold the stuffing in. We're going to sew up the neck area also. We're going to hang this instead of putting it on a spit, so we don't want to lose the juices out of the inside of the bird as much as possible. We have to truss this bird up, and you can find lots of directions for trussing a turkey, but they don't go to the level that you're going to need to truss the bird to hang it up like we're going to. So this bird needs to be able to hang up in front of the fire so that you can rotate from the top and from the bottom. So you kind of got to get creative, but the standard trussing on a bird hooks around the neck, comes around the breast here, hooks the legs together, and then you come up and it holds the wings together. And in our case, we also add a cord from the neck that will go through the legs and extend beyond that. And halfway through, or even a third of the way through the bird, we're gonna have to flip it over. So we'll have to have a string added at that time that will go from the legs around to the neck area, and then on the other half of the bird, we're gonna get a nice brisk fire going on the hearth here and hang the bird up. I'm going to experiment with having a fairly tall fire, not one that's just around the bottom, or else it's only going to get cooked on a very, very small portion of the bird. We will also put up a couple of reflector pieces around the fire to help bring that heat in all the way around the bird, and we'll be able to see as it's cooking exactly what's heating up on this bird and what's not, so we can adjust our fire and adjust our reflecting surfaces. We're gonna roast this by the fire for a couple of hours at least, probably 3 or 4 hours. We're gonna baste this while it's roasting, and the baste is about 50-50 butter and a gravy or a heavy broth. I would baste this every 5 or 10 or 15 minutes, depending on how dry it's starting to look. Of course, while we're basting the bird, we want to be able to bring that baste back up to the top of it. So we're going to have a pan directly underneath the bird. That means the fire has to be off to the side and high. So you can see how that's working with this fire. The interesting thing about it being on a string like this and hung over the fire is the fact that it's fairly easy to spin this bird, and it will naturally sort of slowly spin around, stop, spin the other direction. We don't have to twist it very tightly for it to keep going for quite a long time. It's time to try out this turkey. And one of the great parts about Amelia Simmons' cookbook is that to go with turkey, cranberry sauce. And cranberry sauce is in Amelia Simmons' cookbook. It's again one of those firsts. You don't see cranberries showing up in recipes until Amelia Simmons. Let's give a piece of this turkey a try. Just a little bit of cranberry sauce on there. The perfect Thanksgiving turkey. I really like this cookbook because it does have main dish type cooking. That's right up front in the recipes. Things like how to roast beef. And it also has a wonderful selection of meat pies. Some of them are a little different from others. We have the typical chicken pie, but this particular one is called a stew pie. Now, I think it's special because we don't see another recipe titled stew pie in any of the other 18th century cookery books. So this is something that's similar to regular English cookery, but it's a little bit different and special to Amelia Simmons. She didn't just copy this out of another cookbook. Now, it is very similar to a sea pie, and she also has a sea pie recipe in this cookbook. And we kind of need to understand a sea pie so we kind of have an idea about what she's doing with this pie. It's one of these kind of meat pies that has just meat in it. It has what she calls biscuit dough. We're going to just use a normal paste for that part. And it is layered into a dish, and then it's not necessarily baked, but it's boiled. or as she says, it's stewed. Maybe baking isn't the easiest thing to do for these main dishes because they didn't have ovens or they were using for other purposes, so they do a lot of boiling of meat, and that's what happens in this recipe. We also take note in this recipe that the two meats that are used are salt pork, and she's using veal for the other meat. Now, veal is something that's very common in the 18th century because they needed veal. That's a natural outworking of dairy cows. And in this case, we don't need a nice tender veal because the beef that we have is much more tender than the beef that they would have had in the 18th century. So we're going to use a standard beef cut here, something that you would use for like stew meat. The salt pork we're using today is something that's easy to do. This is a sort of a rapid salt pork where you'll take a standard pork cut that you would get today, you'd cut it into smallish pieces and submerge it into a kosher salt. We don't want to use something that's iodized that might add an extra strange flavor to it. And we leave it soak in that salt. It'll pull the moisture out, it'll firm up the texture of the pork, and it's good to use maybe 12 or 24 hours later. This is getting boiled. It's not getting boiled for an extremely long amount of time. So most of the ingredients here are already sort of pre-cooked. The salt pork, it's been in salt. We do want to make sure that it's cooked all the way through. They weren't quite as concerned about that in the 18th century as we are today. The beef in this recipe is already pre-boiled, and the paste we have isn't something that's going to get browned up because it's being boiled. So we don't really have to worry too much about that part either. So really we're just bringing everything up to a nice safe temperature. Assembling this is going to be fairly easy, especially if you already have the ingredients pre-prepared like the recipe calls for. We're going to take a little bit of paste and put it into the bottom of our bowl. Now, she doesn't call for this to be a true pie. You can't dish a pie slice out of this, so we don't need to worry about getting this perfectly covered like a pie pan. We're just gonna put a little paste down into the bottom, and then we're gonna make a layer of beef, and we're gonna add in salt and pepper. We're gonna put in a little bit of salt pork. We're also gonna put a thin layer of butter on there. Butter is really the moisture that's inside this that's really gonna cook. And then a little bit of our paste or biscuit dough, whatever you happen to have for your recipe, and then another layer of the meat and the salt and pepper, and then at the very top we'll put a layer of paste. Then we have something to seal this or cover this up tight. We'll put it into the water to boil. We will probably do, in our smaller cooking vessel here, boil this for approximately 3/4 of an hour or maybe an hour. This is basically a boiled pudding in a dish or a pot. They did that sometimes with cloth. Many times you'll have boiled puddings, you'll cover this up with a cloth. We've done many of those on the channel, but this one is in a vessel. And that's another similar thing that happens in a lot of English cookery. Here is our stew pie, and I could not end up cooking it like it was suggested in the cookbook, which is basically steaming it, putting it in this boiling vessel. It's very difficult to get that pork all the way up to safe pork temperatures of 160 degrees if it's just in a vessel with basically 212 degree cooking. So you'd have to cook it a long time to get all the way up into temperature. So this is, in the way I did it here, you can bake it. Now it smells wonderful. Now in the time period, they weren't nearly as concerned about getting that pork up to the proper temperature, and so they probably wouldn't have had a problem with having very rare pork in their dish. It was supposed to be salt pork anyway, and that salt really would probably make it safer, but I'm not gonna do it like that. It's time to taste this, and the smell is tremendous. This thing is filled with butter, it's filled with salt and pepper, and then you get the flavors or the smells of the meat. And so I know that this is going to have a killer flavor already. I'll give this a try. The paste is really good. It's got the right, well, so it's pretty salty, but it's because it's got the salt pork in there. You probably don't need to heavily salt that as you're putting it together if you don't like a lot of salt in your dish, but that's a pretty typical flavor for the 18th century. All that pepper in there is perfect, so buttery, so good. This stew pie really turns out to be a tremendous savory dish.
Rice is an often overlooked grain in this time period. We spend a lot of time talking about wheat, we talk about rye, we talk about corn, and how important they were to people in North America, and how things were kind of shifting around and you were choosing these different grains based on the quality or how the growing season was. But we never, seems like anyways, just settle on rice and talk about what's going on with rice in the time period. I chose this recipe because it highlights rice and it's a different kind of a dish. It's almost like a dessert. It's using a lot of cream, some heavy spices, and making a simple little custard. So anybody can make this at home, but it's really interesting that it's happening in this first American cookbook. South Carolina was basically built upon rice. There were plantations everywhere. This is a major cash crop. And if you go there today and you want to do something historical, oftentimes the first thing that's going to pop up is to go and visit a place where rice was grown. If you are concerned about having a very quintessential Carolina rice from the 18th century, you can find that. It's still produced today. Just do a quick internet search and you'll find it just fine. The first thing you need to do for this recipe is to cook your rice. If you've never cooked rice before, it's the simplest thing in the world to cook because you're just taking 2 parts water to 1 part rice. So if you get a cup of rice, you're gonna get 2 cups of water, you're gonna boil it, and then it's going to absorb all of that water. So get it to a nice strong rolling boil, back your burner at home off a little bit, or if you're cooking over a fire, pull it away just a little bit and let it slow boil. It's gonna soak up all that liquid, and when you're done, you're gonna have something that's just nice and fluffy, and it's gonna be ready for the rest of our recipe. Once your rice is ready to go, just put it aside for a second. We're gonna focus on our cream. You're gonna get a quart of heavy cream, put it into something because we're gonna boil this now. And we're gonna boil it with a nutmeg quartered and some mace. So as we get this cream with our nutmeg and our mace in it up to a boil, we're just gonna keep stirring that the whole time so we don't scorch the bottom. Once it's up to a boil, we're gonna add some rice and we're gonna let all that cook together while we sweeten it with some sugar. And then it says to flavor with orange or rose water. Now I've got orange water here today. I'm not a big fan of rose water. I'm glad that I have the option. If you don't have either one of those at home, you could zest an orange, and it's not gonna get you all the way there, but it is gonna get you some of that orange scent and the orange flavor. It's not nearly as perfumey as orange water will be, but it will get you at least part of the way there, and you'll have that experience of smelling the orange. Our rice custard is finished. It looks great. I love the consistency of this. It's the cream just really came together with the rice in the pan, and it looks delicious. It smells great. We're gonna give it a try right now. Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, the mace really comes through. It called for quartering the nutmeg. I think that the nutmeg would come through even more if you grated some, but we're just sticking with the recipe here. The orange water is a really nice touch. It's not overpowering. It's not too perfumey. I didn't use much because a little bit of that stuff goes a really long way. And if you're making it at home, I would suggest don't over sweeten it because it's really nice to let that orange water come through and not have it so sweet. So this is a wonderful little dish. This would be nice for breakfast even if you think something like an oatmeal. It's not necessarily a dessert, and it's wonderful. I chose this recipe from the American Cookery Cookbook because I wanted to showcase lemons. There are a lot of questions about lemons in the time period, and we get a lot of comments in the comment section. Yes, they were fairly expensive, and yes, you could get your hands on them. So you see lemons popping up in all of these cookbooks. It's used quite a lot. This looks like a wonderful lemon pudding, and I cannot wait to try it. One trick for this recipe is that you're going to need a puff paste. Now, in modern day, you can go to the grocery store and you can buy a puff paste, or you can make a puff paste, which is a lot more fun, and you learn a lot while doing it. There's a recipe for puff paste. In fact, I think 9 of them in American Cookery. Pick any one you want. She specifically says to use number 7 or number 9. But we'll need a puff paste ready to go. We'll need lemons, eggs, a loaf of wheat bread, sugar, butter, and some white wine. First thing we're going to do is deal with our lemons. We're gonna grate, she says grate, we're gonna zest 3 lemons, and we're just gonna get the yellow part, we're gonna get it into the bowl, then take 2 lemons, and we're just gonna roll them around on the table to get them loose, and then we're gonna cut them in half and juice them into the bowl. Once that's done, set your bowl aside, and you're gonna go ahead and take your bread and kind of crumble it up. We don't want a whole lot of crust in there. mostly just the nice squishy part of the bread. We're gonna get that into our bowl with some white wine and mix all of that together. So the next step that we're gonna do is just go ahead and get our butter on the heat source to start melting. And that doesn't need to happen super quickly because we've got some things to do in the meantime. While that's melting, we're going to separate some eggs. We need 8 yolks and we need 4 whites, and we're gonna mix all of those together. Once our butter is melted, we're gonna combine that, but we're gonna let it cool down enough that it does not cook the eggs. Then we're gonna put to that a pound of sugar, and we're gonna get all of that mixed together with our lemon zest and our juice in our bread. At that point, the pudding itself is finished, and now we're just gonna take our puff paste, we're gonna line a tart tin or whatever you have at home that will work for this, and then we're gonna pour our mixture into that. And we don't need to pour it in so it's just filled to the brim, leave a little bit of room. We don't wanna make a mess in our oven, but that's it. That's a really simple recipe, but it's gonna be delicious. Would you look at this pudding? It looks fantastic and it smells really good. I was a little concerned when we were making it about the lemon content because at first it seemed like a lot, and then we started adding all these other ingredients and it seemed like it kind of got lost. So we're gonna find out here in a second. Now, if you're making this at home, this shallow container that we have, it baked in about a half hour, but she calls it to go for an hour. So be careful about that, keep an eye on it. But other than that, it's a very easy recipe. Man, okay. The lemon is perfect. It just screams lemon in the best kind of way. It's not tart, it's still sweet, and it marries with that wine really well. So it just really came together. When you start off a dish with a bunch of bread with wine poured on top, you don't think that this is gonna be really fantastic, but it is. And I know that you will love it.
There are some firsts within Amelia Simmons's cookbook, and one of the firsts we see here is the use of chemical leavening in a recipe book. We use chemical leavening so often today that we don't even really recognize it. We use it in cakes and cookies. It ends up in even regular bread products. So it's something we take for granted, but it's not something that was common in the 18th century at all. In fact, the only time we see it really referenced at all in the early part of the 18th century as a trade secret. It was something that the people that were using it didn't want to get out to the general public. And it was only possibly first mentioned in a German or Dutch cookbook for bakers in the middle of the 18th century, and then we have tiny references to it later on in America in the late 18th century. The first time it shows up in a cookbook is right here in Amelia Simmons, and she uses it, even though it's a tiny little cookbook, she uses it at least 3 different times. 2 different cookies and a gingerbread, which is very similar. Now today we might use it in biscuits and in cornbread and items like that. Those don't show up in this cookbook, but it is being used with these cookies. Now, this kind of chemical leavening is a very primitive form. She is using pearl ash. This is similar to our baking soda, but it is not as powerful. And it's using potassium instead of sodium. So if you overuse it, you get a kind of a soapy taste to it. It's really a very interesting ingredient. And one of the reasons why we're using this ingredient is because of the environment we have right here in North America. We had a tremendous quantity of trees and we wanted to get rid of them so that we could farm the land. We burnt them up. And what do you have when you burn up a bunch of trees but ash? Is that ash useful for anything? Well, you can extract potash from all this ash that we had from burning down these trees, and that was a very useful industrial ingredient. We found that we could also use it if we refined it a bit more and made it sort of food safe. We turned it into potassium carbonate, and that is the pearl ash that she mentions in her recipes. Today we'll be doing one of the cookie recipes. Now, this is basically a very simple cookie recipe that we would do today, but she uses an ingredient for the spicing that we might not be used to. It does make a wonderful cookie. This one's super simple. I've cut the recipe in half, so I have 1.5 pounds of flour. I've got about 12 ounces of sugar. We've got about 1/2 pound of butter, I also have coriander seed, a good quantity that's ground up nice and fine. We've got the pearl ash and a little bit of milk to mix with that pearl ash, and that will be the leavening ingredient that creates a nice fluffy, soft cookie, not something basically too hard that would break your teeth. And this, as a leavening ingredient, works in a very kind of subtle way. We're gonna mix it with the milk, and it will not really take off and start to aerate the cookie until it gets hot. The baking is what releases the carbon dioxide and creates the tiny little air bubbles in our cookie. We're gonna change the order just a touch from what she says here in the recipe. We're gonna cream our butter and sugar first together and then add in the other ingredients to get them all well mixed together. We've got our coriander seed, we've got our flour, and once those are all mixed well together, then we add in the milk that has the pearl ash dissolved in it. Now, you probably can't get pearl ash. It's not something that you can find at the store today, so you can use some baking soda in place of that. I've got about 3 ounces of milk and a teaspoon and a half of pearl ash. If I was using baking soda, I'd probably just go with 1 full teaspoon of baking soda. We're gonna mix it all together and roll it out as our cookie dough and then make it into shapes. Depending on how large your cookies are, these should bake about 15 to 20 minutes at approximately 325 degrees. These cookies are out of the oven and they smell wonderful. And you can see they've got a nice texture to them. They break apart. They're nice, soft and fluffy. Now, she does say in the recipe that they can come out kind of hard, but that if you leave them in an earthenware jar, they'll get nice and soft. These are already nice and soft because they're nice and fresh out of the oven. And there's something special about these. They have a special name. They're called cookies, which is not a normal name for the 18th century. English cookery, they don't use that term at all. This is kind of special to this cookbook and to Dutch cookery. So she is close to the New York region, and you can see that Dutch influence on the cooking and the fact that she calls them cookies. So not only do they have the special leavening, but they also have that special name. And even today we enjoy cookies. We don't enjoy something that, if this was English, they might call it a biscuit or something similar to that. Let's give this a little try, and the texture is good. It's got a typical sweetness for a not too sweet cookie. Today we add so much sugar into cookies that we might think these just a slight bit not quite sugary enough. I think they're plenty sugary. And they, even though it looked like maybe I put a whole bunch of coriander in there, no, it was the right amount, possibly even a little bit more for that really spicy coriander flavor. If you really want to bring that out, make sure to grind your coriander nice and fresh.
American Cookery is a fantastic cookbook simply because it has a little bit of everything. You have your roasts and your pies, you have some sweet treats like this pound cake. And it's a wonderful recipe for the little bakers in your life. My kids like to bake, they like to cook. This is simple ingredients, it's equal parts, and it's impossible to mess up. So turn them loose in the kitchen and make this pound cake. So our ingredients are butter, sugar, flour, and eggs, a pound of each. 10 eggs is what she calls for in this. She specifically says 1 pound or 10 eggs. So we're gonna just combine these ingredients together. First thing we're gonna do is cream the sugar and the butter together. And then one surprise ingredient that she has is a gill of rose water. I am not going to use rose water because I can't stand it. So what I'm going to do is use 1 gill of white wine, and we're gonna see what that does for this recipe. Once we get all of these ingredients mixed together, mixed really well, we're gonna put them into a pan. And she says that if you put it into a moderate oven, it's going to cook in 15 minutes. So we'll set our oven about 325, and we're just gonna let it cook. She does say to watch it closely though. We don't want this thing to burn. So just keep an eye on it. It's not gonna go crazy, but we also just wanna stay on top of things. Our cake came out of the oven. It looks perfect. I'm very excited to dig into this. It plopped out of the container just fine. I was afraid that it was going to stick at first, but it didn't. It looks delicious. I'm ready to give it a taste. I want to talk real quick about that Jill of liquid that was rose water. Now, she says specifically to season this to your liking. I do not like rose water, and I wanted to find something that would be a good replacement but not abrasive. I think white wine's going to do the trick. I did not want to lose that Jill of liquid because that would throw the recipe off. And like I said, it came out looking perfect. So let's try it out and see what that tastes like. And it's kind of dense. There's no leavening agent in this, so it's not going to be like a spongy cake, which is something that I like. I like a nice dense cake. So. Oh man, that wine works really well. This is buttery. It's got a great texture. It's not too sweet. This is a perfect like coffee cake. This is great for after dinner when you want something just a little bit sweet, but it doesn't go over the top. I would make this all the time. This is fantastic.
Another unique feature of American Cookery is the fact that it's one of the first cookbooks that uses cornmeal. In fact, I think it's the first cookbook that uses cornmeal. We've got Indian corn being used in an Indian pudding. We have flapjacks or slapjacks that we're going to be doing here, and Johnny cakes. All of these are included within this tiny little cookbook, and Indian corn is one of those things that was so important to the diet of early Americans. For almost 200 years, people were surviving on Indian corn, and yet it does not show up in any cookbooks, any kind of recipes that we necessarily see, except maybe in manuscript cookbooks, individuals' cookbooks that they write down for themselves. But here we have it printed, and we can see how this corn is being used. Corn was being used in bread also in the time, either in a rye and Indian bread, which uses rye and cornmeal, or in a thirded bread, which has wheat and rye and corn in it. But people were surviving on this corn in bread and in a lot of other food products too. We're going to be using this simple slapjack recipe, which is so very easy and anyone can do it. Now, these are basically Indian meal pancakes, which are very common and simple. We're using cornmeal, of course. We want a stone ground cornmeal if possible. Maybe you can get something that has some of that red and blue cornmeal that would be typical of Indian corn in the time period. We've got regular flour. We've got milk, eggs, and a little bit of salt. These just get mixed up into a quick, nice, loose batter, just like we would use for pancakes. It doesn't have any leavening like a modern pancake might, but these turn out wonderful. One of the very interesting things about this recipe is she talks about 3 different ways of cooking them, which, you know, today we're going to fry them in a pan. We're not going to worry about anything else, but she talks about baking them in a pan. She also talks about putting them into a pan that's been buttered and baking them in the oven, which sounds to me a lot like cornbread, and possibly this is a cornbread recipe. We just don't recognize it. Today I'm going to fry these up in a spider skillet with just the lightest coating of butter. We're going to treat these exactly like pancakes, put the batter in the pan, watch for some little bubbles coming up on the top of those, and then you know it's time to flip them. Our slapjacks are out of the pan, they're still hot, and they smell great. She doesn't give us any directions on eating them. She does not say make sure to put maple syrup on them or sugar or anything like that. They probably ate them just like this, and I'm gonna try them out just like this. Got a nice, they're still steaming and good. Got a great texture, really good flavor, especially depending on what kind of cornmeal you get, so make sure to get the good stuff. And I can see how this would be the perfect recipe for one of the first cornmeal recipes in all of printed literature. This little booklet is less than 50 pages long, but it's probably the most concentrated amount of information that we will have about early American foodways that we could possibly find. While we have journals, letters, and magazine articles that give us hints about things like corn or chemical leavening, it's this cookbook that gives us the full context, how popular it was, and that the fact that this cookbook was available to anyone versus a letter that might mention a single use of something. This tells us the true popularity of these special new foodways. If you ask me, this is the Declaration of Independence of American Cookery.